Democracy, one of the hallowed principles of the Western world. Today, we are generally accustomed to the idea that people should have a say in who represents them and should pick individuals who are accountable to them for their actions in government. Whilst there are suggestions that democracy is under threat in the modern age, such claims pale in comparison to how democracy and suffrage operated, or rather didn't operate, in the revolutionary and Napoleonic era. From rotten boroughs to questions of the rights of man, and for that matter, women, the French Revolution, along with the American Revolution, heralded a new age of experimentation in the practicing of democratic processes. So, how democratic was France during the Revolution? Tonight, respected historian of Napoleonic democracy Malcolm Crook makes his Napoleonic Wars pod debut in the first part of a double bill on France's journey through democratic experiments during the period. We talk about the barriers to engaging in the French democratic processes of the age, why universal suffrage didn't take off, and whether democracy was a surprisingly dirty word in the age of revolution. This is Votes for Everyone, Democracy in Revolutionary France. Up next on the Napoleonic Wars pod. Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod, where we are excited. Josh, why are we excited?
We are very, very excited because we are joined by distinguished historian Malcolm Crook, Professor Emeritus of the University of Kiel. He's had a very impressive career, but he's here with us today to talk about democracy in revolutionary France, which is what he's turned his attention to in recent years. How are you, Malcolm?
I'm fine, thank you, and looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you
I
so
am
much
going to
for coming on
be
the show. I'm gonna let Zach say now because in before we started recording, he just admitted that he is a bit of a Malcolm Crook fan.
I mean, I am fangirling quite hard this evening. As I was
I
saying
didn't
before
realize
we,
there were any, so
there you
that's
go. You have met the fangirl. Well, I'm sure by the end of it, Josh will also be a fan. So we'll set up a club or something. I'm sure that's a thing. Um, but yes, as I was saying before we hit record, I read some of Malcolm's research just for fun during my master's grad, which was a particularly unusual thing for me because I was always laser focused on my research assignments. So anything that was peripheral tended not to come into my purview until the PhD. So for me to sit down and read research on the politics and democracy during the revolution, and particularly Napoleonic France, was a departure for me as somebody who was much more focused on other aspects of popular perception. But I found it fascinating. So I am excited and I am very pleased. Well, actually, what I'm miffed about is that we haven't got down and got round to sitting down to do this sooner. But as ever, it takes the provost marshal that is Josh Redden to organise proceedings and whip the producer, host, whatever the hell it is I am on this show, into shape. So yes, we are delighted to have you with us this evening. So thank you very much for your time. And Josh, do you want to kick off, or shall I dive in?
I will happily kick off. I should also say that I am a Malcolm Crook fan, having done a bit of reading beforehand, especially into kind of your book on, I think it's called How the French Learned to Vote, which you published in 2021, and reading especially the relevant parts of that to this interview. I think it's a really fascinating piece of research, and it's something that perhaps I think deserves more kind of interpretation, both like historically and like in popular history, like we're doing today. I guess part of the reason for that is because in the French Revolution, of all the myriad changes it brought about and the ideals it promoted, democracy isn't necessarily the first thing that springs to mind. And then we won't address the Napoleonic period today. That'll be next episode. But um, that's democracy might be the last thing that springs to mind with that period. But notwithstanding, it is subjected to a really lively debate. Even in the benefit of hindsight, we might, even if with the benefit of hindsight, we might sneer with the idea of like a democracy in the French Revolution, or as they had it in the 1790s. So, a central tenet of the American Revolution was no taxation without representation. And as I just mentioned, it's not really an argument we immediately associate with the French Revolution. How far was democracy a grievance of the French Revolution, and how did it figure in the ambitions of the revolutionaries?
Well, I think the starting point really is to say that the situation in France, as in some other countries at the time, was very much shaped by a dispute over taxation. And this is how the French Revolution really kicked off. The monarchy wanted to raise taxes and met with understandable resistance. And although the French, as far as I'm aware, didn't actually use that phrase from the what was becoming the United States, although a lot of people were well aware of what was going on there, not least because the French were backing the Americans in their war of independence against the British. I think it did amount to the French leaders saying to the king, if you want to us to pay more taxation, then we have to have a say in how that money is raised and what's done with it. So to that extent, I think there was common situation, and of course, all of this has to be put in the context of warfare above all, because that's what these states, particularly a state like France, is spending its money on. It's on its armed forces, and you're doubtless well aware that the second half of the 18th century is an age of global struggle. It's a struggle that occurs not just on the continent of Europe, but in the colonies, which the European powers are in the course of acquiring. And the French felt this pressure on its financial resources particularly strongly, I think, because whereas the British, for example, were mostly concentrating on empire and colonial struggle, therefore they were using focusing on their navy. The French were both competing in the continental sphere for continental hegemony in Europe, and engaged in the colonial global sphere in competition with the British. And although France was the biggest country in Europe, it was the most powerful of monarchies. The strain that was putting on the French fighting in those two spheres meant that the monarchy was desperately short of money, and in the end, effectively went bankrupt. And this is what gives the opposition the opportunity to press for the revival of a representative institution, the Estates General, where the wider public can have a say in how these essential changes and reforms will come about. And as in the case of the United States, a dispute over taxation becomes a dispute over authority, becomes a dispute over sovereignty. By what right are you asking for more money? And this in turn transmutes into a democratic demand over sovereignty, which ends up supplanting the sovereignty of the king with the sovereignty of the people, which is the essence of democracy. Although it must be said that that term wasn't actually much used at the time. People didn't tend to call themselves Democrats. Along with the Americans in France, they tended to call themselves patriots because they were for the people rather than for democracy, although it amounted to more or less the same thing.
So, welcome to the Rabbit Hole podcast, where we have a list of questions and then I immediately deviate from them. You've actually started to answer what was going to be my sort of follow-up question, which was to sort of explore the reputation of democracy. And I take completely what you mean, that certainly a modern construction of democracy with universal frankly, universal male suffrage isn't even on the horizon for many nations at this moment in history. Never mind universal suffrage, and therefore, sort of democracy as a concept is still very embryonic during this period in relation to where it's going to go. But nonetheless, you have the ideals underpinning this that people should have a say in how their governments are run, that people should have the ability to choose representatives who will go and assist with that business of government. Now, Britain has a rotten borough system, loves to sort of exalt its kind of long heritage of parliamentary democracy. And, frankly, the debate on just how democratic Britain is during this period in time is a debate for another podcast or seven. But in terms of that core idea, to what extent is democracy a dirty word? Or to what extent are different types of democracy seen as overly subversive? I guess what I'm getting at is what is the reputation of democracy and its varying potential experimental forms during this period? And how does that feed into this sort of bigger conversation about how states should be run?
Well, I think part of the problem is that when people use the word democracy, they're still thinking of Greek city-states. And this is something that may work on a small scale. You could perhaps have it operating in the United States, which at this point in time only has about 5 million inhabitants and is split into a variety of states anyway. It may well work in some of the Swiss states, again, on a small scale. But the problem is people don't tend to think it can operate on a larger scale for a big state like France. It can only work if power is decentralized. And the French certainly don't want to decentralize. They don't want to create a federation of any sort. They deliberately supplant the sovereignty of the king with the sovereignty of the whole people. And one of the great phrases in the French Revolution, after it becomes a republic, which again people were very doubtful was possible in the modern world in a large modern state, is to qualify it by saying it's the one and indivisible French Republic. That's the title of the regime. So in a sense, they're doing something that people hadn't really anticipated before 1789, of building a democracy in a huge state, both in terms of population and geography. But
So,
but it amounts to democracy because, as you're saying, it's essentially a bid to create a system where the people will participate in government, both by voting and being elected to office, and to that extent, they are creating a participatory regime. Their consent is required to govern, and that amounts to us as democracy. I don't have a problem with using that term, but it wasn't one that was especially current at the time.
sure. Apologies for chipping in.
No, no,
Um,
please do. Please stop me.
no, no, not to, on this podcast. Nobody gets stopped. That is not the way that we operate things here. I was struck by something you were saying within that, though, about how when it comes to the French, um, let's call it experiment. I'm not entirely sure if I'm happy with that phrase, but let's call it an experiment with this style of government. You sort of you talk about how this isn't really anticipated and nobody's really sure if this is going to work. And it makes me wonder, therefore, what people are making of what's going on in the United States. And should we therefore read into this that people don't really have high expectations of the United States, and therefore there's this anticipation it's all going to go horribly wrong, which granted it is actually a a British school of thought, and it's sort of an area of argument. The colonies are going to come back to us in the end because they're going to have their experiment. It's all going to go horribly wrong, and then they're going to come crawling back, and it's all going to be fine. Obviously, that line of reasoning didn't play out in reality. That wasn't a thought that ended well, but here we are. Um, am I reading too much into what you're saying there, or is there a lot of skepticism about what is happening in the US as a viable form of government?
Oh, well, it is quite a long way away across the other side of the pond, and it is regarded as it isn't regarded as the great powerhouse of democracy, in the way it's come to be seen in the years since. To that extent, I think people weren't paying particular attention to it. France is far more important in terms of this experiment, because France is very much the cultural heart of Europe. Loads of people speak French, educated people, highly educated people. They all speak French. They're all steeped in French culture. France is the leading power in Europe. We have to remember Britain was still in the process of becoming a great power during the period before the revolution. The Industrial Revolution hadn't occurred. So what happens in France is terribly important, because it's the cultural leader of continental Europe. But I think the experiment is nonetheless, Zach, quite a relevant term, because the French do a heck of a lot of experimentation during the 1790s. I mean, I've sometimes described it as being a political laboratory with lots of different things being tried out. Whereas, of course, the irony is, in America, they've still essentially got the system that they created at the end of the 18th century. And to strike a current note, of course, that's why they still have this electoral college to choose the president. That's straight out of the 18th century. And part of the reason is because the Americans didn't want to trust all the people. They might say, this is government by the people for the people, but when it came to the pinch, they still wanted safeguards against what they would see as demagoguery. And it's interesting to note this is something which has changed in the American Constitution. Until 1913, the Senate was indirectly elected as well. That wasn't popularly elected. Again, the Senate, the key bit of the legislature, they wanted to safeguard that and to ensure that well-heeled, well-educated individuals were the ones who were running the show. And it's precisely the same at the beginning of the French Revolution. Not only is the franchise restricted, but it's even more restricted when it comes to participating at the level of electoral colleges, which were used throughout the French Revolution and in the Napoleonic period, precisely as a safeguard against too much popular control of the new representative system. Now, in the case of France, all of that, as it were, got out of hand by creating a representative system. They opened something of a Pandora's box with all sorts of interesting, including demands for female suffrage during the 1790s, which didn't achieve anything. But the very fact that those demands were being made was, I think, significant.
I do lambast Zach, but here I am going to ask an unscripted question myself. I hypocrite.
Do go ahead. They're much more interesting, I'm sure.
See, it's easy to criticize Josh, but once you've got the bit between your teeth, you just can't help yourself, can you? I am vindicated. I am being very smug right now. I mean, actually, that's not a change to proceedings on this show. I am quite often really quite smug. But yeah, go on, Josh.
So that whole point about the American Revolution and kind of discussion about how far it was in the minds of Frenchmen, I think it raises the question about when French people summon upon the language of like democracy and popular sovereignty, what are they actually talking about then? I mean, because you say even the word democracy wasn't really being used in France. So it's one thing to have an idea of like popular sovereignty in the nation, and it's another thing to be talking about a system where there's male suffrage, where people are going to vote, or where, you know, even stuff beyond that, I guess. So my question is, what are French people actually talking about kind of in the build up to revolution when they talk about democracy?
Right. Well, I think basically emerging out of this crisis of the monarchy, you have the deputies who are representing the people at the old-fashioned Estates General of 1789, because that's how it starts. The monarchy doesn't want to consult, it doesn't want to take advice, but in the end, because of its financial circumstances, it has to accept the recall of a traditional representative body in France, which is very antiquated in the sense that it's comprised of three chambers: the clergy, the nobility, and everybody else, or representatives of those three groups. But as soon as the monarchy agrees to to recall this old antiquated body, which hasn't met for 175 years, the whole nature of the debate changes, and the so-called patriots, the Democrats, if you like, say, the people don't have enough say in this traditional body. We want it to be much more open and more genuinely representative of the people as a whole. And the essence of the revolution in June 1789 is that the people who by that time have gathered as an Estates General in the traditional format force through its conversion into a national assembly that represents the nation, where clergy and nobility and third estate categories are just dissolved into a single national body. And that's the essence of the political revolution of 1789. That it's national sovereignty rather than monarchical sovereignty. And then, of course, hard on the heels of that comes the question which is discussed over the next couple of years, which is how do we actually put that into practice? And this is when discussions over who's going to be elected, how are they going to be elected, how many people can vote. This is when these questions are extensively debated, and it all comes out in the Constitution of 1791, which a lot of people regard as a moderate revolutionary document. But in fact, if you compare it to what is now known as the old regime, what went before, it is extremely radical. And it contains a lot of radical possibilities. And as I've already suggested, once you open up these questions, then you find people wanting to go further. And the fact that the franchise is limited encourages a movement to extend it further, even to the extent of including females. So that's how this process, I think, begins to unfold, and it proves terribly difficult to halt in its tracks. And a lot of people spend a lot of time in the 1790s trying to end the revolution. But there's always people who want to continue it. They say, no, it's not finished. It's not complete. And in the end, it's our friend Napoleon who does manage to bring this process to a halt. But more of that on another occasion.
It's
Hope that
interesting.
helps. Yeah.
It does. Well, I can't speak for Josh, but he's been nodding along enthusiastically over the course of your answer. So I think he's enjoyed your response there, and it reminds me of what must have been something like the second or third episode that this show ever dropped, which was on the French Revolution, and it asked the question, what went wrong, in a slightly facetious way, in that sense of sort of the revolution being something that sort of spirals, and then everybody thinks it's going to reach an endpoint, and it doesn't, and it spirals a little bit more, and it spirals a little bit more, and then you go through terror, out the other side, and then on to Napoleon, and um, a number of the original ideals seem to sort of disappear in the context of this repeated spiraling. And people lambasted me quite heavily and told me that I needed to go away and sort of learn a little bit about my own nation's history, because people love to be terribly patronizing when they comment about things. But it's interesting to hear you kind of talk about this idea that the revolution is never really, people want to end the revolution. Well, some factions want to end the revolution and go, okay, let's draw a line under this now. We've gone far enough, and others don't. And tied up within this is, of course, what you're saying about female suffrage. So I suspect now is a good moment to just explore that a little bit more and kind of query the what are the reasons that that concept doesn't take off? Because this is a period where women gain far greater rights. And, you know, what's the, I mean, Alex Mikaberidze has spoken about, you know, the idea, or spoken on this show about how that as soon as the idea of women's rights comes out of the box, everybody's desperately trying to sort of close the lid and put the genie back in the bottle, as I mix my metaphors here. And of course, Napoleon sort of the culmination of that. But why is there not that momentum gathered, I suppose? Is this representative of cultural attitudes at the time? Is this a sort of counter reaction to women? Oh, hang on, suddenly women are gaining right. Oh, how do we feel about this? Oh, let's not give them the right to vote. You know, that would be taking things far too far. We're not really sure we want them to have what they've already got. You know, next they'll be wanting to elect female representatives to government. You know, this kind of things are scandalous. We can't have it at all. Is that what's happening? As I sort of say all of this in a somewhat tongue-in-cheek way, or is there something else at play here?
Well, I think well, I can't resist starting with the irony that women had to wait until 1944 to get the vote in France. So France was one of the last countries in Europe, at any rate, to grant female suffrage, whereas it was one of the first to grant a pretty universal male suffrage. But I think one of the problems here was that that was seen to be outrunning the possibilities of the time. I mean, it was a fairly minor uh, sort of aspect of the revolution compared to the demand for greater equality, particularly in the political sphere for men. And of course, in the end, it was men who were running the system, and therefore were in a position to try to ignore these demands for a female franchise. But it's worth saying that in terms of equality between the genders, women did achieve a significant amount in the revolution, even if some of that was reversed under Napoleon. And one example of that would be in terms of women's rights within the family and women's rights to divorce and so on, when these were enacted in the middle of the 1790s. But I think the major struggle really was to achieve what later became known as universal male suffrage. Although again, we've strictly speaking, we have to be careful using that term, because it was actually only coined in Britain in 1798 to be precise, and didn't really get across the channel until the 19th century. But certainly as early as 1789, radicals like dear old Robespierre, who of course is later notorious for his role in the Terror, when you might suggest the revolution was going wrong. He was a great advocate of all men having the vote, and of course in a sense, the revolutionaries created a rod for their own back because they had the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen at the start as a kind of great declaration of principle of the for the new order. And Robespierre was able to say, well, hang on a minute, now it's come to deciding who can vote. All men, at any rate, aren't as equal as you suggested a few months ago. And that, of course, posed a problem, led to a significant movement, particularly among the urban groups, particularly at Paris, for a widening of the franchise, which does come to pass in 1793. So there is an evolution in that regard. And it's certainly also an evolution that's marked in terms of the people who are all holding office, certainly at the local level. Ordinary people, peasants and artisans, are actually holding local office because by the mid 1790s they have the vote and they are able to be elected. So there's a whole significant shift. Whereas I think the objective at the beginning, to use the old Marxist term, was to have a bourgeois revolution, where the old privileged aristocracy would be put to one side, but it would be the wealthy non-noble property holders who would benefit from the new regime and would be the people running the system.
You've spoken at length there, Malcolm, about kind of the constitutional and like legislative transformations that France underwent after 1789. You said how the État Général becomes the National Assembly, and eventually, well, France gets through a lot of assemblies, doesn't it? We have the Legislative Assembly, the Constituent Assembly, and other ones I've probably forgotten, and it ends up in the
It's rather confusing, I'm afraid.
Exactly. Good job you're here. And then the National Convention emerges in 1792. So in this kind of chaotic period of the revolution under the convention, which I guess is the first kind of protracted like legislative body that France has, how do elections actually work? And I appreciate this is a very hard question because it has different answers in different places and different times. But like, who is organizing these votes? Are they national? Are people across France like turning up to ballot boxes and then being collected fairly and counted quickly? Or I mean, and I suppose who is voting in them as well? There's so much to say. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, one point to make, which I think will interest listeners, is the fact that, roughly speaking, there were 1 million posts up for election in France in 1790, because virtually every office, every public office, was turned over to election. Whereas, of course, in the past it had been largely a case of appointment, or in some cases people were actually purchasing their offices as judges. So it wasn't just politicians and administrators; it was also people throughout the justice system who were elected. They even went in for electing the clergy. There was the militia, the National Guard. All of the officers in that became elective. So there is this huge opening up. They really take this principle of election to town. And even at the beginning of the revolution, when the franchise is more limited, something like 4.5 million males out of 6 million males actually have the vote. Now, of course, the whole point of my recent book was saying people have to learn to vote. They have to be encouraged to use it, and the turnout levels were often disappointing. And it was pretty rare for more than 50% of the this huge electorate to actually turn out and vote. But the other thing that the French were terribly keen on after 1789 was that there should be uniformity. and that everywhere should be following, unlike the old regime where things were different in different parts of the country. There would be a uniform system, whether it was voting or anything else. So, literally, people were voting at the same time under precisely the same circumstances all over the country, whether that was to elect their local council, whether it was to elect their representatives in the National Assembly, or whether it was to elect their National Guard officers, because part of citizenship is a big word, and part of citizenship was not simply participating in politics; it was also participating in defending the policy through the national militia, which of course has some echoes across the pond in America as well. Being a citizen meant you had an obligation to defend the nation. But the curious thing about voting, which it took me a long time to get used to, is that I'm afraid it wasn't like today, where people simply went along to a polling station and put a bit of paper in a box. Voting in the revolution meant going to an assembly and voting with other people. Now they used ballot papers. They started using ballot papers. It wasn't a question of raising hands or taking your hat off, as had happened in the various elections that happened at the local level before 1789. But they were doing this collectively. And one of the important reasons for doing this collectively was that you could therefore police what was going on. And when we come to see them perhaps on another occasion, the problem with the Napoleonic plebiscites, the Napoleonic votes on the Constitution, was that there was no public control over counting the votes, and that allowed fraud to occur. The great thing about people meeting in an assembly was that they were able to observe votes being counted and the results being decided in public, and that was terribly important. I mean, they even elected their own officials. So the first thing you had to do when you went along to one of these electoral assemblies, which was usually held in a church, because that would be the biggest building that was available. The first thing they would do was elect their own officials, their president of the assembly, the secretary of the assembly, and the scrutineers or the tellers who would count up the votes. And this is all very much part of this, the sovereignty of the people. The people are running their own elections, and they're in charge of it. Now, of course, that didn't mean that abuses didn't occur. There wasn't sometimes intimidation or violence, but the principle was that it was a secret ballot, in the sense you wrote down the names you wanted to vote for on a piece of paper, but it was in public. And that struck me at the beginning as being very, very odd and very unsatisfactory. But the sense of it was that this ensured that, or tried to ensure that things were done correctly. The downside was that you had to spend some time voting, because it meant perhaps spending a whole day conducting these various procedures, which were made more onerous by the fact that the French insisted on an absolute majority to be elected. So you had one round of voting. If nobody got 50% plus one, you had a second round of voting. If nobody got 50% plus one, you reduced the field to the top two vote winners, and then you got a winner at the third round. But this meant you weren't just voting once, you weren't just sticking a bit of paper in a box. You were participating more widely. But the other interesting thing, sorry to go on about this, was that because people were assembled in that way, they were able to discuss things as well as actually vote. And very often they would, once they'd finished voting, they would pass a number of resolutions about things they were unhappy about, either at the local or at the national level. They draw up petitions between themselves to go to the authorities. And if you think about it, you know, a lot of the voting we do outside of the sort of civic level, that tradition remains. We have a meeting, perhaps of our club or a society or whatever, and we elect our officials. We discuss as well as vote, and it's that sort of tradition that this comes out of, which takes a toll in terms of participation because it's time consuming. But for those people, and I've calculated very roughly, I like stats, you know, perhaps 2 million people during 2 million adult males during the 1790s participated at least once in this electoral process. And of course, as a result, they had a very deep experience of voting and participating politically in a way which you know, we don't do today because it's just a matter of hopping into a polling station, putting a cross on a paper and sticking it in a box. It's all over. That's our citizenship done. And interestingly, I can't resist saying, you know, because that was the way the British did it in the 18th century, albeit using poll books and open voting. This led Rousseau, who came from Switzerland, where elections were practiced prior to 1789, to say the British are only free at that moment where they're declaring their preference. Otherwise, they're slaves. They're not real democrats, as they like to pretend. Sorry, I've gone on a bit.
Not at all. This is the Napoleonic Wars podcast. I mean, the questions go on a bit. Never mind the answers.
The nitty-gritty of what actually happens in these elections. Yeah.
What I'm loving there is that I think Josh is starting to enter his Zach White era of questioning, because that question was long and waffly and complex and unpleasantly hard to answer, as are 99.9% of the questions that I ask on this show. So I have trained you very badly, Josh, but I am impressed in how you've picked up my questioning style. I should probably offer you a pay rise for that. I'm going to continue to conform to my trope on this show, which is to ask a question that was never on the sheet that we agreed beforehand. And that's to pick up on what you're saying there about civic responsibility, because I'd never sort of really dwelt on this idea that there's a cost involved in voting, actually. I mean, I often think about sort of the cost that's involved in giving testimony in a trial, because you've got to skip a day off work. That's a day's wages that you're going to lose. So to what extent does that create a barrier to the voting process that well, I'm not sure if it's sort of ever thought through at the time, whether it's kind of deliberately there, whether it's sort of tacitly there in the sense that, you know, if you can't afford to take the day off, then maybe you're not the sort of person we want voting anyway. You know, is that an intent there? Is it something that just sort of happens anyway? And then the flip side of this, if you give citizens the power to choose your representatives, and then your representatives go to war, and then you call upon the people who elected you to sign up through conscription, to what extent is the notion of suffrage then used as a tool to kind of guilt trip the population, in that sense of, look, you had the power to choose who was going to elect you. We, as your elected representatives, are now saying you need to go to war, and the nation needs to go to war in its own interests. And any true citizen would not only go and vote, but would also be willing to make this sacrifice. Is it basically what I'm getting at? Is suffrage used as a tool to try and sort of bolster support for things like conscription as France slides towards sort of whatever the late 18th and early 19th century equivalent is of total war?
Well, I think it certainly works the other way around, and those who were excluded from citizenship, if they served in the armed forces, they were then guaranteed the vote, even though they wouldn't otherwise qualify for it. So this showed the close relationship between citizenship on the one hand and military service on the other. But I think that duty towards the patrie, these obligations of citizenship were very strongly emphasized. And it's interesting, contemporary note on this in terms of voting. The French actually all have a voter's card before they go to the polls these days. And on the front, in big letters, is written, "Voting is not simply a right; it's also a duty." And I think this is something that's emphasised in the revolution, if you like, the duties of citizenship as well as the rights which go along with it. Now, does that make people more willing to shoulder the burden to make the sacrifice? It's also interesting in the tax system. They started talking about they called income tax your patriotic contribution. Were people fooled by this into or encouraged by this to be more willing to hand over their taxes? But I think it is it is all part and parcel of this sense that you are sovereign, but that carries responsibilities as well as rights. And inevitably, trying to impose that. I mean, this meant that education was terribly important. They talked about education for citizenship during the revolution, but sadly, they didn't have the resources to create the grand system of universal education, which they hoped would go along with those aspirations. But you can see how it all fitted together as part of this notion of the sovereignty of the people.
Zach used the word experiment earlier, and I think it's a might be a good word to use when you consider kind of the international context of the evolution of democracy in the French Revolution. Because obviously the rest of the world isn't overly democratic, and some of these changes which we're talking about feel pretty radical by the standards of the 18th century. So on the one hand, while I can imagine there's some like quite snide remarks, perhaps from people who live in Britain, for example, but also is there a sense of, wow, this is democracy happening on an unprecedented scale. We thought it was, as you say, something that was small and was impossible to do with millions of people, as France is trying to. But if France can do it or try to do it at least, perhaps it was more viable than we first thought. So what is, I guess, the picture from the outside looking in?
Well, I mean, the French are very keen to emphasize that their revolution is a revolution for humanity as a whole. The revolution is cast in universal terms. They don't say all Frenchmen are equal. They say all men are equal. So these are universal principles which are capable of being applied elsewhere. And there is this sort of messianism about the revolution, which is one aspect of the warfare of the period. That the French are keen to take the benefits of their revolution to their benighted neighbours. Now, of course, the benighted neighbours didn't always see the advance of a French army on their territory as a great step forward for humanity. But there were educated people in many countries who were, of course, very drawn to what the French were doing, and nowhere more so perhaps than in Britain, where there are a lot of admirers of the French Revolution, particularly in the earlier years before it becomes more violent in the middle of the 1790s. And I'm tempted to quote you Wordsworth at this point. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive, and to be young was very heaven. France standing at the top of golden hours, and human nature seeming reborn. That a lot of people were terribly enthusiastic about what was going on. But of course, there were others and the majority, it turned out, who were alarmed by the sort of experiment the French were conducting. And again, Britain, because in Britain there's a lot of sympathizers. In Britain, there's quite a severe crackdown on those who are using the inspiration of the revolution to advance their own agendas for political reform. And even more worrying, of course, is the emergence of Irish patriots who want to see Irish independence from the British yoke. And the leader of that, a guy called Wolfe Tone, he headed for Paris in the early years of the revolution, and then went back to Ireland to foment revolution there and Irish independence around his organisation, which was called the United Irishmen. So, and of course, in the end, as you're well aware, under Napoleon, to a still greater extent, the ideals of the French Revolution are exported on the end of a bayonet, and neighbouring territories are brought into an expanded French Republic, the so-called reunited departments. Other people might call them annexed departments. But these countries, we'll see this under Napoleon, were given the same institutions, the same elections, the same rights as the ones that were possessed by those in the original revolutionary front. So there was this universalism, which I think lay behind what other places saw as French aggression and French expansionism.
You mentioned Napoleon. Speaking of plebiscites, now we won't go into Napoleonic plebiscites. We will save that joy for another day. Not least because there are many jokes that we can crack, and I want to relish in them when it comes to how curious they are, shall we say. Now, today, we have a lot of association between referendums and dictatorship. It's a known, I used to teach a politics course when I was a secondary school teacher. It's one of the things that we sort of split out and you sort of go, look, Hitler quite liked a referendum in order to give himself legitimacy. Some people like to draw sort of lazy comparisons between Hitler and Napoleon. I'm never a fan of those, but nonetheless, there is sort of this sense that referenda, particularly if the numbers are cooked a bit, are quite popular amongst dictatorial figures. Now, when they start being used within the context of the French Revolution, they obviously don't have that association, which is a very different way of sort of thinking about referendums today. To how we think about them today. So why, I guess, is the first question, why use referendums, particularly considering the scale of the exercise involved? And then what impact do they actually have for the French political landscape?
Right. Okay. Well, to start answering that, as early as 1789, one or two people are saying that whatever the National Assembly decides in terms of the future political structure of the country, this should actually be put to a popular vote of all the people before it's put into to practice. Because if we're talking about the sovereignty of the nation, then the nation should have the final say in something as critical as this. Now, that didn't come to pass with the Constitution of 1791, the first revolutionary constitution. But by the time you've come to the Republic and a more democratic phase of the revolution, then from the very beginning of the National Convention, which is in charge of creating another constitution, that's its basic job, right at the beginning they say our work will be put to a vote of the French electorate before it's put into effect. And so I don't think there are any of the plebiscitary connotations that we would attach to later exercises of this sort. At that particular point, it's seen as being extremely democratic. I mean, it's worth saying, a pedantic point, that they don't use the word plebiscite at the time, and in fact they don't use it under Napoleon either. It's only Napoleon III in the middle of the 19th century who actually uses that term. I mean, officially, it is a vote on the Constitution, and that happens in 1793. It happens again in 1795. And again, this acceptance or rejection of the Constitution, there were some people who voted against it in 1793. There were certainly a lot who voted against it in 1795. That happens in assemblies where, at the beginning, this is again this perhaps tedium for some people. The Constitution is read out at the beginning of the assembly before people then make comments about it and then vote on it. And so, very interestingly, and I've looked at a number of these documents, people aren't just saying yes or no; they're also making comments on different aspects of the document. So I think that that really is a sort of participatory exercise on both those occasions. The Napoleonic plebiscites are, as you're aware, somewhat different. But I think we can have confidence in the results, by and large, because sometimes it wasn't always clear whether a person had voted yes or no, and so on. But by and large, those two documents were genuinely accepted by the majority of the people, overwhelmingly in 1793, to a somewhat lesser extent in 1795. But of course, that was in the wake of the Terror. There was a lot of bitterness, division, and so on, which was marking those later years of the revolution. The great optimism. I mean, this is, it's hard to recover it when our vision of the revolution is the terror and the guillotine. But there was this tremendous enthusiasm of the sort which Wordsworth expressed across the Channel. That they really were creating something new and beautiful in France.
You allude to it there, and that's death. That optimism increasingly begins to die, I think, towards the end of the revolution after 1795. First you have the Directory, and then the consulate, and then obviously the empire itself. So it's a steady trend, if you like, of de-democratization or winding down. But as we said, nevertheless, elections do continue, or plebiscites do continue into the Directory and afterwards. So I guess this is a nice final question. By the end of the French Revolution, is democracy back to square one in France? I really like your maxim that you have, that people have to be taught how to vote. So, to put it in those terms, have the French learned anything?
Well, of course, they were learning by experience, because I think the educational setup that they wanted to provide, at least for future generations of French men, were not put in place. But I mean, they had certainly had this amazing experience of voting a great deal in significant depth. And although in the end, perhaps I've estimated perhaps 40% of the population participated on occasions, if not regularly. Nonetheless, I think that was a tremendous legacy in France about what democracy or the sovereignty of the people actually involved from that political point of view. And I would suggest, part of the proof of that is the fact that although not a lot of people realize this, Napoleon did continue that process after he came to power. Not simply in terms of somewhat manipulated plebiscites, but in terms of voting for national assemblies and local councils. So that heritage is perpetuated. It's hard to sort of prove these things, and try as I might to know what ordinary people made of this different experience, apart from whether they took part in it or didn't. But I think it was a very profound experience of voting and political participation, which of course was reinforced, and this is where it wasn't the same under Napoleon, by the ability to join political societies and clubs, which again a rough count at least 1 million people were involved during the revolution in participating in popular clubs and societies for political debates. There was an extremely free press and circulation of ideas, at least until the middle of the 1790s. So it was an unprecedented period of political participation and opportunity, which I think in the short term didn't become definitive, but of course picks up again in the 19th century. And in 1848, France is the first country on the planet to award the vote without any exceptions at all to all adult males. So France remains very much in the forefront of that process, at least for men in the century that follows.
That sets us up very nicely for what's going to follow in the next episode. It's almost like we gave you a script and told you, frame this in a particular way, because those ideas about sort of resistance through political expression and what we can and can't understand about people's thought processes through their engagement in democracy is very much at the heart of what I want to explore when we look at what happens in Napoleonic France. But folks, you are going to have to wait for that interview. It will be incoming in the new year. But in the meantime, as you start to ponder what you're going to buy yourself for Christmas, surely you now need to go and acquire yourself a piece of Christmas reading to better understand how democracy works in France during this and more broadly in France over the course of the nation's history, so that you will therefore be better informed ahead of our next recording on this. So, How the French Learned to Vote, A History of Electoral Practice in France is available from Oxford University Press. Malcolm Crook, Emeritus Professor at Keele University. This did not disappoint. It's been a long time in the offing. I have immensely enjoyed our discussions this evening. I'm sure Josh has as well. Our listeners in the room from Patreon will also no doubt have found this a fascinating discussion. We'll pick up with them in just a moment. But for now, on behalf of all of our regular listeners, thank you so much for your time. Folks, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. We will be back very soon. Hello again, folks. As the festive season approaches, why not spread the festive cheer in one of a few ways? Firstly, reviews. Most of you probably listen to this when you're in the car, so can't do anything when you hear our pleas to leave a review. If you're listening to this at home during the festive season, though, there's a chance that you can reach straight for your phone. So head to Apple Podcasts, leave a review and a comment. It costs you nothing. But if every single one of the 2,000 people tuning in each week did it, we'd be one of the top-rated shows in Europe. Please, if you appreciate the free content, give us 30 seconds in exchange for the hundreds of hours of material we give you. Looking for a Christmas gift? Got Christmas money to burn? Head over to the Napoleonic Wars pod shop on Printify, we'll put a link below, and get your hands on the Now Napoleon Assists, Now's Your Time mug, the Secretary at Home t-shirts, and a host of other merch. Want a personalized hoodie? We can provide that. Get in touch with us at napwarspod@gmail.com. You have a Napoleon assist in your life? Are they gagging for access to our socials, our online course, or exclusive behind-the-scenes access to our interviews? Well, you can now gift a Patreon membership to the show. Head to patreon.com/the Napoleonic Wars pod to find out more. Prices start from £2 a month, and excitingly, we are doing a Patreon giveaway. Anyone who is a member of our Exploring Officers, Mentioned in Dispatches, or Admirals tiers on Patreon on the 21st of December 2024 will automatically be entered into a prize draw. The winning 3 will be given free access to the full Legion to Scholar experience for the month of January, from the online course to the behind-the-scenes access to interviews and the Meet the Author experience. To enter, just be signed up as an Exploring Officer, Mentioned in Dispatches, or Admiral Patron by the 21st of December 2024, and if you win, we'll let you know in time for Christmas. Shout outs to all of our patrons. In the Mentioned in Dispatches tier, Rob Griffith, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Ruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Carol Dixon Smith, Roland Shark, Giovanni, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Darla Vincent, Brendan Hogan, Peter Findley, Jeff Maple, Ian Harding, Indiana Fats, and Joe Ayres. The Admirals, Mark Chestnut, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, David Maxwell, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Charles McKay, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, Tim Pritchard, the enigmatically named Zed, and Seth Hansen. The Chiefs of Staff, Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, the Legion to Scholars, Dan Hazelwood and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire Todd Campbell and the Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. Merry Christmas, my friends. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke and Josh, take care of yourselves. Have a great festive break. Stay well, enjoy the mulled wine, and as always, thank you for listening.